Good afternoon from Washington, D.C. This is Jeff Payne, returning as part of the Indian Ocean digital series that NISA has been hosting for the past 7 or 8 months. I am pleased to be joined today with a returning alumni of this program, Dr. Tom Lynch, who is at INSS at National Defense University here in Washington, D.C. Worked with him closely on several projects and have shared the hallways of NDU with him for almost a decade now. And we brought him back today to do a deeper dive into how he sees what's going on in South Asia, how India is impacting the wider Indian Ocean region, and then how great power politics adds into the complexity that is the Indian Ocean. So to start with, the first question to you, Tom, is this. There's been a lot of attention around the world on the importance of India's strategic rise. A lot of analysts, especially outside of India, have talked about what it means for India to take on a greater leadership role and a greater strategic role in the Indian Ocean. So my two-part question to you is, as an outsider, as someone who is not in India but deeply familiar with its government and its institutions, how real is India's rise? And then secondly, what does India's rise mean for South Asia? And then if you want to get broader, to the whole Indian Ocean rim. So to you, sir.
Hey, great, Jeff. Thanks very much. Delighted to be back here as part of the program. Thank you for having me aboard. My appreciation to you and NISA Director Terry Wolf, as well as Chief of Staff Dave Lamb. Let me just highlight as I start here to answer your first very stimulating question that the opinions I'm going to express here are my own and based upon my own research and interaction with, as you mentioned, well over a decade of focus in my research portfolio on South Asia, India's rise, and most recently the impact of great power competition. So these are my own thoughts, my own research, and they don't necessarily represent the views of my own institution, the Institute for National Strategic Studies, National Defense University writ large, the Department of Defense, or the U.S. government. Having said that, I think you put your finger on something that's been very near and key to my own research and interaction here, which is India's strategic rise. So let me address those two components you had about India's strategic rise, if I could, based upon somebody who spent a lot of time looking at this. Prior to COVID, prided myself on being able to travel to India and meet with major decision makers in both interview format and then participation format on an average of 2 times a year for the past decade. Looking forward to getting back to that once we get beyond COVID. So to kind of describe for you what I would assess as what I frame as India's long, slow, but certain rise. So India has been looked at now for the better part of 15 years, I believe, as a strategically critical player. First in its region, and then now increasingly in the Indian Ocean region or the wider Indo-Pacific, and eventually to the global order as a whole. I say that as a matter of fact, but I need to mention that that's in some circles controversial. Right? Prior to, I would argue, the early 2000s, people around the world were not sure how India would relate or matter within its own region or beyond. The late, great scholar of South Asia's security, politics, and relations, Stephen P. Cohn from Brookings Institution, used to say that because of the manner in which India interacted with Pakistan and underachieved quite often in its relations with Pakistan, that India kind of had an underperforming strategic profile for the better part of its first 47 years. And I'd say that as we went into the early part of the 2000s, there was still enormous skepticism on part of the outside world as to whether or not India would be able to rise above its own internal limitations, its own political factions, and somewhat of its own, insular particular viewpoints. As many in this audience will know, prior to the end of the Cold War, India's international profile largely consisted of aspiring leadership to the non-aligned states and and then in that capacity, an effort to be seen as a champion of developing states or lesser developed states. And then at the same time, starting in the early 1970s, with a pact of friendship and reciprocity with the old Soviet Union. That latter pact, coupled with India's staunch position as non-aligned and not playing in the Cold War squabble between the United States and the Soviet Union, left India's strategic profile quite a bit adrift in the eyes of a lot of the world. And when India opted in 1992 to make a pretty dramatic sea change in terms of how it would situate itself at the end of the Cold War, that is, choosing to try to reorient itself to a capitalist international economic profile with an export-led growth strategy, and a certain but rather gradual conversion from a command-directed economy into a more market-based and liberal-oriented economic framework. That launch in 1992 was greeted in a lot of places as with a kind of a, well, let's wait and see mindset. Would India get its act together or not? By the early 2000s, India started to make a strategic impression, I think, primarily in the economic sphere, not so much in the military or political sphere yet at that point. Particularly, India began to be seen as a great potential consumer market. And indeed, many Western states, including the United States, but also Europe and Japan and several others, started to see market forces within India showing some promise. And so that was kind of the opening, the foot in the door, if you will, to India's kind of strategic rise. And India's rise since then, has moved on and had dimensions beyond just the economic. Has moved on now and had dimensions that have involved, political presence in a lot of different international organizations and leadership in many different factions that are there. It is included greater and increasing interaction in its military with the rest of the world. Although one might be counseled here to recognize that the close affiliation that India's military developed between 1971 and 1991 with the old Soviet Union, where much of its kit and equipment, especially in the Air Force and the Army, as well as a lot of Navy hulls, came from the Soviet Union. That here now, almost 30 years later, remains a legacy. And a legacy that's in some cases a limitation, and I'll come back to that later, for India's strategic presence. But then there's also been what I would call kind of an ideological metamorphosis of India. In its evolution from, featuring non-alignment in the Cold War and rather prideful positioning itself as outside of alliances and partnership structures internationally, India has, starting in the mid-2000s, particularly with the United States, but also noteworthily with Japan, and to a lesser extent South Korea and Germany, it started to be seen not only as a large consumer market, but also a reciprocal partner to grow and develop international trade, finance, and political systems that are open, that are relatively liberal, and that are durable for the long haul. And this was kind of established as a marker, I think, most prominently by who many in your audience, I think, will recognize, as India's most prominent strategic thinker for many decades, the late K. Subramaniam, who just before his passing here in the 2012-2013 period, was making a number of presentations, speeches, and op-eds in India, suggesting that India's long-term destiny was to engage and involve itself with the states of the world we know as the West, particularly the U.S., Japan, and Europe, as states that were anchored around pluralistic governments, around liberal frames of reference and understanding of people and personages, and of relatively and reasonable open markets, free exchange of commerce, and the resolution of disputes in a peaceful manner. And I'll talk about this later because I think you have another question coming up, Jeff, about the geopolitics of great power competition. But I just wanted to mention here that by Subramaniam saying that in the year or two before he died, he was also anchoring a framework that said that he saw the greatest threats and that India saw its greatest threats to its future as being tethered to both global jihadism, which India had been partnering with the United States by this time, by the early 2010s, for a little over a decade in combating, but also what Subramaniam called the rise of authoritarian and pluralist denying states that based themselves in markets but were not really liberal oriented. And so, India's strategic rise, I think, is linked to that. And Subramaniam identified what he called inevitable convergence of long-term U.S. Western interest and Indian interests around this strategic framework. That is, standing as a cluster of governments that were oriented around a positive approach to political governance, which was liberal democracy, to markets and market-based exchange, and the peaceful resolution of disputes, as well as standing firm against authoritarian or authoritarian-led regimes as being in their rightful place to dominate. Now, Subramaniam's time frame here was lengthy, and I think that's important to note. He wasn't talking about something that was going to culminate in years or even in near-term decades. And now, coming up on near a decade from his death, I think we're seeing that kind of temporal patience being played out. India has slowly emerged in its relationships with the U.S., particularly strategically, as being far more interested in partnership, as is with its relationships with Japan, even more perhaps than the U.S., being very interested and oriented around strategic partnership, and in selective engagements with European countries, being very interested in its engagement. So I think those are taking place, but they're taking place on what some of us euphemistically call India time, not on Western time. Okay, so slowly, deliberately, sometimes haltingly, sometimes in a frustrating manner, but nonetheless, as Subramaniam said, most certainly towards this convergence of the world's oldest democracy, the United States, and the world's biggest democracy, with kind of a common set and a framework of strategic interests. So if I define that as India's rise, still ongoing and still with a lot of latent power that it can still develop in all these areas, diplomatic, economic, and military, when it takes additional steps to liberate itself from some of the structures that still hold it back. I think that's the long-term play, if you will, the long-term game. But nobody should be deluded in thinking that India is going to join any alliances anytime soon. India, I think, remains wedded to the notion of strategic autonomy, and it will have partnerships, thank you very much, that orient around shared strategic interests and long-term aims, but it will not be interested in outright alliances. And so that's, a factor for India that I think sometimes we in the West get too deluded about and misunderstand as a limiter on this. So what about the regional impact? Well, here I think we're kind of in a 1 foot on the accelerator and 1 foot on the brake kind of era right now. Because while India shows this promise and shows a lot of engagement in outside activities, within the region, India still is in many ways challenged by the tyranny of its history. It is still side by side with Pakistan, and Pakistan and India remain mortal, if not existential enemies. And the dramatic flare-up in fighting, engagement, and violent interactions in Jammu and Kashmir over the last 12 to 18 months have really highlighted that factor and kept India, perhaps in some quarters, particularly its military side, oriented on that particular extreme challenge. It's Pakistan conflict, which is a conflict of no peace and no war, and which has the combustible zone of Jammu and Kashmir to play in all the time. And India's relationship, although improving in many ways with several of its neighbors who over time have been either antagonistic toward India or distant from India. By that I mean improvements with Bangladesh, which we've seen some of recently in terms of territorial areas, improvements with Nepal in certain areas as that relationship has moved forward, and even in certain areas with its relationships with Sri Lanka. I mean, those continue to evolve positively, but I think the region remains wary of India in terms of it getting too big, too demanding, or too impatient with some of its neighbors. And so I think there's a little bit of still a kind of a foot on the brake there, as India still has challenges, most notably with Pakistan, but also with the concerns and worries of its smaller neighbors that right now limit India's ability to do like, say, the United States did in the late 1800s, and not have to worry about any Canadian threat or any Mexican concerns, and therefore be able to look upward and outward. Well, we're not there yet with India, and I don't think we're going to get there anytime soon with India. So I'd be remiss if I didn't take your question, Jeff, and highlight the fact that there still is that kind of regional wariness, suspicion of India, and India's need to focus a lot of attention on its own internal regional conflicts, most noteworthy Pakistan, that is a delimiter on these other strategic and grand strategic rise aspects that are noteworthy and that I think really indicate the way the rest of the world right now perceives India as a truly latent power, and one that over time is bound to rise and matter more and more to all the dynamics of international relations and international affairs in the Indian Ocean region and beyond.
Thank you, Tom. Your final points there about the complexity of the neighborhood, I think, is often overlooked. And it's kind of a reality about all of the Asian kind of rising powers. I mean, this is kind of the complexity of the neighborhood is part of what drives China's activity. The considerations of geography are also what drive how Japan operates. So to imagine India not having to address similar concerns, especially given its history, as you point out, is a data point that needs to be reconciled. But you mentioned in your response there several times the specific relationship, the bilateral relationship between the United States and India. And in conversations I've had with various people here in the United States, I get a wide variety of responses. Some want to rip their hair out in terms of they are frustrated by the lack of progress. They see the light at the end of the tunnel, but they just can't seem to get there. Others who almost are so positive and bullish on the U.S.-India relationship that sometimes they seem almost removed from the reality of the very complex bilateral discussions and conversations that have to commence. Those are two poles that we get. I'm guessing that the reality is somewhere in the middle, but can you flesh that out a little bit? Speaking more from kind of your vantage point, you have these deep relations in India, but you also are well tied in with the conversations policy-wise here in D.C. How would you frame that overall progression of the relationship, say over the past 20, 30 years since India has made this liberal market transformation, export-driven kind of trade system, and an open advocate for liberal democracy?
Yeah, great question, Jeff, and it gets to the heart of kind of some of these major issues that dominate, discussions here between policymakers in Washington and policymakers in New Delhi and those with an interest. So I think the best way to characterize this as an overarching setup is to put it in context of what one of my think tank friends in town is want to say in his presentations, and he's worked on India commercial relations for the better part of 30 years. My gig has been a little bit more in security, political and diplomatic relations here over the last 20 years. But he puts it this way, and I think it applies. It's like when policymakers in Washington look at the U.S.-India relationship 3 years ago, they're frustrated by how little progress has been made. When policymakers in Washington look back at the progress that's been made between India and Washington 5 years ago, they're amazed at how far it's come. And when policymakers look back a decade ago and assess the relationship and what was planned a decade ago and what's occurred now, they are again frustrated by how slow the progress with India has been. But when they look back all the way to 2005, when there was the agreement cut, the first real strategic agreement cut between the United States and India in terms of nuclear policy and nuclear weapons exception, they can't believe how far the relationship has come from those very dark days. So I think that's a useful metaphor for understanding the relationship between the United States and India. You know, one morning you can wake up and be amazed at how far it's come, and the very next morning, because of the hazards of bureaucratic engagement, the bad fortune of things not happening as fast as you would like them to, or reversals in the way in which one or the other of our leader groups thinks about things, you can feel as bad the next day as you did good the day before. So that takes us back then to kind of this wider framework that I talked about in the first question. You know, what is the end state? What is the end goal? And then how do you assess or evaluate against that? So if the end state or the end goal is this eventual convergence between the United States and India as proud, positive, and durable partners standing in favor of the key elements that are laid out in the U.S. India 2015 Joint Strategic Vision for Asia-Pacific Affairs. And these are the ones we just talked about a little bit before, which is the pursuit of free and unfettered trade across the Indo-Pacific region, the pursuit of individual rights and human rights requirements across the Indo-Pacific region, the free and fair exchange of all kinds of goods and services, the resolution of differences and disagreements by peaceful means and not by force of arms or by dint of coercive approaches. I mean, those are the framing things that over time K. Subramaniam talked about, and I think most U.S. policymakers hope, somewhere as we get more towards the middle of this century, will be common features and the foundation for a bedrock partnership between the two countries. But just because we're not all the way to alliance, that means some will remain disappointed even 20 to 25 or 30 years from now. But I think by using that framework, one can think about how far things have come between the two countries. And I'll do that just in the kind of, you know, diplomatic, intelligence, military, and economic, you know, approach, the dime approach, if you will, to just flesh out the answer a little bit, Jeff, if I can. You know, first, economically. I mean, here is where the majority of what I would call the main frictions between the United States and India remain. The United States is a very obvious and aggressive international capitalist country that would like to do joint ventures, buy in, and have a lot of say in economic partnerships within the countries it's working and engaged with. India, although it has liberalized enormously over the last 30 years, is nowhere close to being willing to partner or engage with the United States with that level of familiarity. And that creates friction. And that's going to take time to evolve, time for different parts of Indian industry that are still heavily protected and subsidized, agriculture, some financial, and a number of other places in India, quite frankly, that because of India's federal system are very difficult to work with because of the different rules and regulations in the different territories that India's central government can't override just by the stroke of a pen or the decree of its leader. Okay, so I think that is one of those time horizons that's going to be in the 20 to 25 years before we see kind of, you know, convergence and reciprocality there. I think if you then look in the diplomatic world, I think India and the United States now see far more eye to eye in these general grand terms of the future than they ever have before. But there's still great differences because India retains one, strategic autonomy, and two, a view of the world where it still sees itself, even though it's now very much more economically developed than it has been any time in its past. It still sees itself as a champion of the underprivileged countries of the world, of the lesser developed countries, and therefore it looks to be treated in trade agreements and commercial agreements and other places as though it's still a developing country. And that lends frictions diplomatically to how well or positively the U.S. can interact and interface. At the same time, India and the U.S., particularly over the last decade, have come to a common view on the scourge of international terrorism, the scourge of jihadism, and the way forward in that area. So I think diplomatically there are still common points there which one can build out on. So that's kind of an intermediate place where one can move forward. In terms of intelligence and military, and I'll roll these up here together. First and foremost, what's difficult for a lot of American policymakers and other Western policymakers who aren't expert or skilled in dealing with India is to understand how deeply culturally vested Indians are in strategic autonomy. They do not talk in terms of alliances. They talk in terms of partnerships, which means partnerships that are oriented around transactional and shared values. Now here, there is definitely a shared value right now between India and the United States, particularly, but also some of the rest of the world, in terms of not allowing China to have its way on border disputes or to play, bully move the ball politics to resolve long-standing border disputes, whether those disputes be in the South China Sea, adjacent to Vietnam, or particularly for India, along India's northern Himalayan border. And there we have seen India now repetitively stand up to the point of actual hand-to-hand combat this last summer to try to deal with what is in essence about an 1,800-mile disputed border area, right? And so the United States is supportive of India in that, but India right now is not coming to the United States for direct military involvement, engagement, or even, rhetorical support. Because again, India values strategic autonomy. India values taking care of its own self in its own way. That doesn't mean it doesn't agree with the United States or the United States isn't aligned with it about the concerns about China's unilateralism and border control and change. And at the same time, let's highlight Tibet's there as well. And the U.S. and India see the plight of the Tibetan indigenous peoples the same way. Both see China as having taken, broad and unacceptable steps to compress, if not crush, the Tibetan cultural history that India particularly thought China promised in 1955 that it was going to protect and respect in Tibet. So that's still kind of there as well. But having said that, I think militarily, while there's still a difference between the two countries, and there are limitations in how far it can go, one of those is what I discussed earlier, which has to do with still how much Indian military equipment and kit are from the Soviet era, which really limits a lot of the amount of interaction and exchange the United States can and will do with India. And then India, magnifies that a little bit by its strategic autonomy approach. When it does make large weapons procurement purchases, it tends to try to spread the butter out evenly amongst a lot of different suppliers, so it doesn't be seen as favoring one country over the other, back to strategic autonomy. But I say that then to contrast it where I think there's been a lot of progress between the United States and India that's below the surface, and that really is setting the stage for mid to longer term convergence in being able to interoperate, not in the next 5 to 10 years, but longer term. And what I'd highlight for the group here is the fact that, while everything else in the world has been going on, if you haven't been paying attention, India and the United States have finally finished here just last October, signing what we refer to, in military circles as the fundamental enabling agreements that kind of allow your militaries to interoperate in critical areas. And I'll just tick those off for you real quick. So in August of 2016, after more than a decade of failed efforts going back to 2002, the India and United States signed what's known as a LMOA, a Logistics Exchange Memorandum of Agreement. It kind of is like an LSA for strategic partners that operate directly in alliances. Okay, so it enables reciprocal access to military and dual-use facilities for the purposes of things like refueling, replenishment, and other agreed accommodations. Okay, so the LMOA. That's done and signed, August of 2016, over 15 years of trying to get it done. Second major of the four documents, signed in September of 2018, known as COMCASA, the Communications Compatibility and Security Agreement. Okay, that too required more than a decade of negotiations, but finally got done. And this allows Indian military to receive modern, secure, and net-enabled weapon systems, such as precision armaments, air-to-air missiles, space systems, and navigation systems, all of which are critical components to things like fighter aircraft and unmanned vehicles. Okay, now before that, India had to purchase more expensive commercial equipment. Now, since 2018, they can come more into the U.S. supply system if and when they desire. Next, there was actually the extension to the third of the four agreements, this thing known as the GSOMIA, ugly acronym, but it means General Security for Military Information. Well, that had been signed in its basic form in 2002, but it still needed an industrial security annex, which didn't get signed for almost 2 decades. But in the summer of 2019, a year ago last summer, that eventually got signed. So now that's in place, an industrial security annex to protect secrets when there's industry interaction. And then the final document, which I alluded to a little earlier by saying it was signed in October of 2020, is this thing called the BECA, or the Basic Exchange and Cooperation Agreement for Geospace. And in the modern era, that's important, okay? Because prior to this document, the U.S. could not share its geospatial intelligence and analysis with India or vice versa, okay? And that was true for both commercial and military stuff. So now that's in place, all right? And so when you look at those four things and you look left and right and you say, okay, what does the India-U.S. relationship not have in terms of enabling agreements that, say, our U.S. partners have in our alliance structure? The answer is no difference, okay? The names are different. I'll acknowledge that. They're not called LSA, it's called LMOA. It's not called some of the other terms, okay, but it exists. And so there's your foundation, and it's quiet, and it's below the surface, and it's pragmatic, but as I tell our military officers that I talk to over the course of the years and in our lectures here around NDU campus, you know, if they're logisticians or they're folks that are involved in planning and plotting operations in the Indo-Pacific region, over the next decade, they're going to be spending time in India, time that none of their predecessors really spent unless they were assigned to the embassy in India. And the reason is we have all these agreements now that can allow for further expansion of interaction, engagement, and activities. Again, it'll be slow, it'll be quiet. Indian politicians don't want to bring too much attention to this because they're autonomous, but it's there. And at the high end, we just concluded in October last year the third of 3 annual U.S. India, what are called 2+2 ministerials. So that's where the foreign ministers of each country sit down and the ministers of defense of each country sit down and talk face to face about mutual issues. The United States does that only with about 2 handfuls of countries around the world. It now does this with India on an annual basis. It started in September of 2018. The second round was in December of 2019, and the third round took place in India here in October, late October of 2020. So, I mean, those are kind of, you know, big deals, Jeff, and the folks in your audience that suggest to you that there is now both kind of the foundation for moving forward, particularly in the military intelligence arena that hasn't been there before, to extend and expand partnership, not alliance, but that it also still leaves frictions economically and somewhat diplomatically, but that are uneven and growing unevenly, yet in a fashion that allows us to think about this broad or grander convergence over time between the world's oldest democracy and its largest democracy around these core values and principles, plural governments, liberal approach to human rights and activities, and the peaceful resolution of disputes. So offer you that in terms of some thoughts about the U.S.-India relationship.
Very detailed and very helpful. I mean, honestly, I think you're getting to the issue that there's going to be crests and troughs with the relationship. People need to get accustomed to that. I've heard a colleague of mine, I've heard explain that the U.S.-India relationship, think of it like waves coming into the shoreline. That, but it's all moving in the right direction. It's all coming into shore. It's just that may not be in the pattern you want it to see. But you alluded to China, and that gets into the issue that is all the rage now in Washington, D.C. and other capitals, and that is what we call great power competition. Now, as it relates to India and how South Asia as a region factors into great power competition, I have no real kind of center point in which to base any analysis. So this is not going to be a precisely worded question to you, but I'm interested to see how you navigate it. Because on the one hand, you have U.S.-India relations. And from a very, very meta perspective, you could see as a reaction to kind of China and Russia and other authoritarian countries increasing foreign policy aggression and adventurism. On the other hand, there are a lot of the specific points needed to fill out kind of a partnership scheme to oppose those actors who want to undermine the rules of the road, who want to undermine the rules of the international system that aren't present. That, to put it a different way, the U.S.-India relationship in the framework of great power competition is a great signal to send, but how much are they really doing other than bilateral agreements and some naval exercises and some other military exercises? Now, that's a cynical point of view. So counter that for me. Explain how U.S.-India relations matter for great power competition if you can, and then also how South Asia, why is South Asia always considered to be a focal point for where great powers are going to be attracted? It's almost like a flies and honey. So if you could get into that, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, sure, Jeff. Sounds great. So a couple of different threads in that question that I'll tug on here, because I know your time is not unlimited. As I mentioned earlier, one of the research areas that I've focused intently on the last couple of years or so, after not doing a lot of it since my graduate school and Ph.D. days, has been look at geopolitics and particularly great power competition. And as I think your folks may be able to have access through the NISA site, we here at INSS just published a book in October called Strategic Assessment 2020 Into a New Era of Great Power Competition. And so I, as the editor of that book, plus being the author or co-author of about half a dozen of chapters in that book, would encourage your audience, if they have the time and are interested, to take a look at that. It's free online, and it might get to some details that I won't even take the time to try to take a stab at right here. But let me pull on the two threads you have there, and first kind of talk about why great power competition is what it is right now, and why it maybe be important to your audience and your alumni out there to kind of understand that as fundamentally different. And I'll tie that back again to this point about strategic focus and case subramayam, because there is kind of a commonality there. And then second, I'll talk about the South Asia region and what that means, and why I talk about South Asia as being the convergence of two strategic triangles. Right, the one triangle that's a competitive triangle is the one between India, Pakistan, and China, and then the other triangle is the one between China, India, and the U.S. All right, so think of those two. I have a slide that I'm unable to share with you today, but it kind of lays those two side by side, and shows the crosswalk there between India and China as the place where those two triangles come together. Let me come to that as my second point. First point I want to make is that one thinks about the South Asia region, and one thinks about how it matters or not to the meta challenge, what I call the meta challenges, right? The big issues of any global period of time. You have the post-Cold War era, where after India, Pakistan, and much of the subcontinent, gain independence and wrestle with that, they then have to confront in the 50s, 60s, and 70s what to do about the Cold War and how to align. And their choice at that time kind of defined how they mattered, globally in this kind of big picture area. India's choice was to be non-aligned, to not affiliate directly or purposely with either the United States or the Soviet Union with comment. The with comment was in the run-up to the war we now know as the War of Bangladesh Liberation. India, fearful of potential Chinese intervention to help what was then East Pakistan and the Pakistanis, India signed a treaty of peace and friendship and cooperation. Note those words: peace, friendship, and cooperation in 1971 to give the Chinese something to look over their shoulder at, with the Russians behind them, just in case they wanted to get frisky. When India took the intervention that it did into East Pakistan, now liberated Bangladesh. But the bottom line there is that was India's approach. Pakistan's approach was to side with the United States against the Soviet Union. Matter of fact, side, in so many ways that it was almost head spinning. Joined two of the United States anti-Soviet alliances. The answer to the question of what's the only country to join both SEATO and CENTO, well, it's Pakistan. And then engaged itself heavily in trying to provide assistance with the Nixon and Kissinger trips to China to pry China away from the Soviet Union. Right. So all the anti-Soviet stuff was where Pakistan was. So that was that framing. And that's what dictated kind of the relationships. And that's why the United States was very cold and chilly towards India through most of the Cold War. Okay, then we move into the immediate post-Cold War period, the 10-year interregnum, if you will. And the United States is focused more at home, not so much on that part of the world. There really is no organizing premise other than perhaps, American unipolarity, American hegemony during the decade of the 90s. India is trying to find its way out of, command-driven economies and into an export-led, more market-based economy, but it doesn't want to divest itself or, be wholly subservient to the West. So it's an interregnum period. Pakistan is flailing around. And oh, by the way, India and Pakistan both at that time are taken to task for the development of their nuclear programs. Okay? Both countries, in competing against each other, set themselves up for the ire of the Western Nuclear Weapons Club and wound up being sanctioned heavily in the mid-1990s, especially for the period directly after the 1998 nuclear tests that each conducted, which was then followed a year and a half later by another trivia question answer, which is who are the only two nuclear-armed countries to fight war with each other? And the answer is India and Pakistan, because they did it in 1999 up in the Sichuan Glacier. And the Cargill, and so that's the answer to that question. But then we move into the next organizing principle, which is the organizing principle of counterterrorism, which really launches and kicks off in many ways in South Asia much earlier, but globally it kicks off, with the 9/11 attacks. And here the meta challenge, if you were, turns to this issue of global terrorism or Salafi jihadism, versus kind of the more open society world. And India sides right away, on the side of the Western world on that. Indeed, it wants the Western world to embrace its terrorism challenges with Pakistani-sponsored groups up in Jammu and Kashmir and groups that have attacked in India for a long time. Pakistan finds itself on the other side of that and in quite a difficult position there, right after 9/11. And in many ways, Pakistan maneuvered in a fashion that's just, almost a slippery eel's tale of great imagination, right? It found a way to not be branded as a state sponsor of terrorism, but not all the way also give up its affinity and its addiction to Salafi jihadists as part of its security establishment. So, but I'm talking here that became the great meta challenge at the time, was who's on side against jihadism and in favor of democracy, human rights, openness, and multi-pluralist societies. India and the U.S. aligned there, and to a great extent, so did China, because China had its own internal problem with its Salafi jihadists. And let's also add in Russia here. The other of what's become here the great powers of the late 20-teens and the early 2020s. So they all kind of were aligned there together. No other combination of countries even matched the U.S. military power. So there was kind of this, idea of, state governance against this beyond the state, this non-state jihadist challenge. But we're now into, even though we've not ended the anti-Salafi jihadist challenge totally, we're now into this challenge that I talked about earlier, which is the one from K. Subramaniam, which is, the rise of one-party authoritarian states that stand in opposition to multi-party pluralist states that are organized around individual rights, human freedoms, and a propensity towards markets, free and open markets, that are not coerced or intimidated by states. And early on in the 2010s, it was China that was the poster child for that. Russia has kind of moved into that space a little bit as well, although they're a little bit more of a klepto economy and kind of an illiberal democratic state, not an authoritarian state in many ways. But nonetheless, they stand opposed to multi-pluralist countries in this wider framework. So what does that mean then for India, Pakistan, and South Asia? Well, let me just add, in that process, Pakistan has found itself increasingly marginalized in many ways, and also left alone in some good ways, because over the last decade, as the attention is turned to this challenge of the rise of one-party authoritarianism for the U.S., and it now has this kind of label of great power competition between those that are oriented on this other frame of reference in the United States. I guess what I wanted to offer here was South Asia's framing has turned then from not where you side on the Cold War or where you side on being counter the jihadist threat. You are being evaluated now and looked at in terms of how you stand and where you stand in this meta challenge of today, the new era of great power competition meta challenge, which is a challenge amongst and between states that on one side favor multi-party pluralism, openness and freedom in terms of individual rights and liberties, free and fair access and trade, with countries that favor one-party authoritarianism, with closure of that space, with discrete limits on individual rights and liberties that value the rights of the state over the rights of the individuals. And so that's kind of what I would call the framing, right? The umbrella framing. And it's established, a lot in the book I just talked about. So let's take it down the level then with your second part of your question, Jeff. So what about South Asia? So my point here is where some in your audience may have gotten kind of comfortable with thinking over the last decade or so that kind of the major elements of the relationship are anchored around how do you side versus jihadists, or how do you side with openness of your market in terms of trade, because there wasn't this other existential competition demanding. Well, now that competition is there, and India already has that competition with China, right? India already had it. It doesn't necessarily want to share it in an alliance with somebody else, okay? But it wants to emotionally share that pain. It wants to emotionally be on side with outside partners and supporters like the U.S., like Japan, like Australia, and like other like-minded countries. And it also wants to brand Pakistan as being on the wrong side, right? Even more so, branding Pakistan less as a rogue jihadist state, but more of an exemplar of all too familiar and comfortable with one-party authoritarianism, even though it brands itself, Pakistan does, as a liberal democracy, right? So India's framing of Pakistan, which relates to this new kind of meta challenge, is to ask others to limit interactions with Pakistan, to see Pakistan's fundamental illiberal status as the anchoring point about what it is and what it has been. And then for the rest of the region, there is this interplay now between the great power competitors, the US, China, and Japan, right? And in that sense, countries like Bangladesh, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, the Maldives, as well as Pakistan, they're making choices. Do they invite in Chinese money? Do they invite in Chinese, political leverage? If so, how much and to what extent? Does that alienate the West and keep the West out, or does that encourage the West to give them an offer that may be a better offer? Can they play that off to get a better deal? Where does India fit in that? Can they get a better deal from India if they threaten to bring in China? Likewise, what are the risks? If you bring in China like the Sri Lankans did, are they going to expect a 99-year lease and then try to extort you if you can't pay the money back, or make you pay back in terms of political items as opposed to the latter, economic exchange? Pakistan, for example, what's going to happen there now as China has invested more and more money in the flagship program known as CPEC, the Chinese-Pakistan Economic Corridor, but Pakistan shows more and more challenges and inability, and in some cases even an unwillingness to help see those projects through. And China is starting to get a bit embittered, and the ports and the things that are involved there may or may not be places where China wants to establish more physical presence. And what will that have to do in the region? So I make those points, and we could go on here for another hour and change. But my point is to say that the meta geopolitical challenge has now moved on to this grand framework about, are you on side with democratic multi-pluralist countries, which India aspires to be and the United States is affiliated with, along with others, or are you comfortable interacting with one-party authoritarians, either playing the fence to get a better deal, or being seen, as some see now Pakistan, as being all the way over on side to one-party authoritarianism, particularly with China? So, I mean, I would offer to you that that's kind of, what I think the framing of the region has changed to, both the risks and the opportunities to the two big players, India and Pakistan, right? And then also to the smaller players in the region who have other choices to make, but are making them now in the context of this great power competition where two of the major players, the U.S. and China, have lots of physical and economic resources to play that game. All right. India, not so much, but India still has presence resources. Russia playing, in many ways, punching above its weight, but also playing and wanting to get engaged in the region. But it's really right now back to those strategic triangles. It's this triangle, of competition between China and India, where the U.S. plays directly, but then there's also the interplay of the triangle between Pakistan, China, and India, where the U.S. plays indirectly. So seeing the region as two strategic triangles interplaying and interacting, I think is the best way to think about it right now in terms of this kind of great power era that we're in, and also how it's moved us from the Cold War through the jihadist fight and now to the meta challenge of multiparty, pluralist, free market economies being challenged by and competing with one-party authoritarian states and societies along all those different dimensions of competition with, as you mentioned in your question, Jeff, South and Southeast Asia being kind of a fulcrum for that right now because they are closest to the big players, China, and then the U.S. presence, which has long been there from Japan straight the way down to the Indian Ocean region with this enormous navy and this kind of enormous commercial presence that pits these two countries, China and the U.S., right up against each other and makes a lot of the countries in between now have to think differently and choose more carefully, perhaps, than they did, and for different reasons than they did, in the decades that have preceded now, the late 20-teens and going into the 2020s. I hope that helps.
It does. And we suffer from the problem where you give so much information that we could go on and on and on. I mean, right now I want to turn to the issue of smaller states in South Asia and what options. You talked about choices, what choices they could have, but we are both we both have other requirements, and so we have to, at least for now. We know you'll return in the future, but for now, pause it here. But there's so much data that you mentioned, and additionally, in the description for those of you watching, the Strategic Assessment 2020 that Dr. Lynch alluded to, we will link it. We linked it on the introductory page. So if you missed that, and now at the end of the video you want to go back and find the link, you can go back to the beginning of the video and find the link there. But Dr. Lynch, to you. Thank you so much for your time. I know it's a crazy period in Washington with the beginning of a new administration. There's a lot of scrambling. It's the start of a new semester for you. So with all of that, thank you for carving out time and providing us a lot of data points that are necessary for analysis and a greater understanding of what's going on in the Indo-Pacific region. So thank you again.
My pleasure, Jeff. Thank you.
All right, you take care.